Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's business series conversation on nonprofits. I'm DJ Martin, Director of Advertising for the Portland Press Herald. Today, our business projects editor, Carol Coultas, will be moderating the panel discussion on strategies for nonprofits to navigate financial challenges during the pandemic. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors for their support of our program. Thank you to Cross Insurance, Katahdin Trust Company, and our presenting sponsor, Multiyear Savings Bank. Here to say a few words is Jack Lufkin, Southern Maine Market Manager for Multiyear Savings Bank.
Good afternoon. I am Jack Lufkin, and I'm the Southern Maine Market Manager for Multiyear Savings Bank, and we are thrilled to be this year's presenting sponsor of the Portland Press Herald's Business Series. We're the 5th largest Maine-based bank, and we've grown by helping businesses and nonprofit find their yes. Luke's Lobster, Lone Pine Brewing, Med Rhythms, and Mainly Tubs have all partnered with us to moving their business forward. We also say yes to our communities and nonprofits. Last year, we donated $1 million, and our employees volunteered over 8,400 hours. And this year, we've launched the Multiyear Yes Grant, where nonprofits around Maine will share $100,000. You can learn more about that at movingmaineforward.com/yesgrant. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Jack. And with that, we'll turn it over to Carol and her panelists. We hope you enjoy.
Thank you, DJ, and thank you also, Jack. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We came to this topic in a little bit of a circuitous route. I happened to volunteer with the Board of Finance in my church, and we were really wringing our hands trying to figure out how we were going to set a budget when our traditional fundraisers were sidelined by the pandemic. And they're the kind of thing you can imagine, like barn sales and holiday fairs and public suppers. And it occurred to me, and doing this against the backdrop of no longer having the safety net of the PPP money. So it occurred to me that if we're grappling with this in this little tiny rural church, I can't imagine what the broader Maine nonprofit community is feeling with these sorts of headwinds and challenges. So I called Jen Hutchins, whom I will introduce in just a minute. And I said, is there help out there? Are there resources? And she said, yes. There is no silver bullet, however, because Maine's nonprofit community is so vast and embraces so many different kinds of organizations. There isn't one strategy that can be applied for everyone. But I think that with Jen's insight and our other panelists, we'll be able to offer you at least a few takeaways that you can apply to your own organizations. And I think there's intense interest in this because we have nearly 400 people signed up for today's webinar, and that is by far a record for us, and I think is an indication of how important this issue is. And it's actually not really a surprise if you think about the impact of Maine's nonprofit sector. In the state of Maine, that sector contributes more than $12 billion a year towards Maine's, total GDP is about $65 billion. So 20%, maybe more of our economy rests on the shoulders of nonprofits. And that's a lot more than the national average, which is about 6%. So there's outsized impact, I think, when the nonprofit community has a particular challenge. So, and I realize that for nonprofits that are on the front lines of dealing with the pandemic, the healthcare providers, the social service providers, the cultural organizations, there is an increase in demand for services, and yet the revenue streams have been really compromised. So there is help. Some of that help will be in the form of new federal money, but it's not going to be delivered in the same format that the PPP loans were with directly to the organizations themselves. So we're about to just dive right into that. And let me first introduce our panelists. As I mentioned, Jennifer Hutchins is the Executive Director of the Maine Association of Nonprofits, the state's leading organization for charitable nonprofits. It has more than 1,000 members from all 16 counties. And MANP advocates for nonprofit community, offers resources and programming, It really is a remarkable organization, and I'm assuming that many of you who have logged in today are already members, but if you're not, you should check it out. Prior to joining the association, Jennifer was executive director of Creative Portland, where she led the city's efforts to strengthen the creative economy, and she spent 9 years as director of communications at the USM Muskie School of Public Service. In May of 2020, Jennifer was selected to participate on Governor Mills' Economic Recovery Committee, tasked with putting forth recommendations to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the state's economy. And Jennifer holds a master's degree in public policy and management. So welcome, Jennifer. Also joining us is Barbara Leonard. She has been the president and CEO of the Maine Health Access Foundation since October of 2016. It's an organization that promotes access to quality healthcare and improving health through a network of grants. Many of the current programs focus on building the capacity of community-led organizations to create health outcomes that are more equitable for every person in Maine. And grantees have helped to improve systems to address critical health needs, coverage, and access to care. Barbara brings over 25 years of experience in leadership in philanthropic and public health development, administration, management, and evaluation at state and national levels. At MIHA, she has played a key role in leading the foundation's efforts to advance equity and developing health reform initiatives. She's past president of the board of the Maine Philanthropy Center and the Maine Women's Fund. She's a graduate of Colby, and she has a master's in health policy and resources from Yale. And speaking of the Maine Philanthropy Center, we have the current president and CEO of that organization with us today, Jeannette Andre. The center is an association of grant makers. They have a mission to provide opportunity, leadership, and support to advance the effectiveness of philanthropy in Maine. It promotes shared learning and collaborative action among a network of more than 70 grant maker members and 300 nonprofit and consultant members. She brings to this role a strong commitment to social and racial justice, forged through her own personal experiences, and after serving in various roles at the Lenny Zakim Fund in Boston for 7 years. She holds a bachelor's degree from Florida University and a certificate of nonprofit management and leadership from Tufts. So welcome to all of our panelists. So let's begin. And the first question is going to be to you, Jen. There's been a lot of information swirling around about more federal assistance headed to Maine to support nonprofits in lieu of the PPP. That money is not expected to be delivered directly to organizations. So I'm wondering if you can kind of give us an update on what your understanding is of that assistance, how your organization is preparing for that, and if there are some tips that you can offer other nonprofits. And so with that, Jennifer, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Carol. And first, let me thank you at the Portland Press Herald for bringing us together around this really critical question. How are nonprofits, and particularly small ones, of which we have a dominance in Maine, just like the small business community, how we're going to get through the reverberations that continue to face nonprofits who are experiencing continued challenges. And so thank you. And as you already indicated, I can see in chat that we have many of our members are joining us already. And thank you all for your support of the Maine Association of Nonprofits. Together, we can make a difference with regards to how we're going to get the support we need so that we can continue to deliver the services that nonprofits offer and what makes Maine such an amazing place to live. In terms of federal support, Carol, it's complex. It's very complex. Okay. And the reality is right now is first of all, I want to say you're absolutely correct. Most of the money that we're talking about right now, people call the ARPA money. And it's the federal relief money that came around sort of as the second wave after the CARES Act. And this ARPA money is this amount of billions and billions of dollars that are going to all 50 states and being disseminated to states, counties, and municipalities in different sizes and chunks and all of that. And the important thing to note there is exactly what you said, which is it's not earmarked for organizations. Organizations are eligible to receive it. But the decisions still reside with state government officials or county commissioners and those officials or municipal officials in terms of how they're going to choose to spend it and allocate those resources. However, the story there, as complex as it is in terms of what my organization, as well as our counterpart at the National Council of Nonprofits is doing, is encouraging nonprofits to think about how they might be in touch with their state and local officials to talk about how they are making those decisions around their allocations. Why? Because these funds don't have to be allocated. They don't have to make their decisions until 2024. And then they don't have to be expended until 2026. So there is a timeline here where there is opportunity for public officials to take their time in deciding how they're going to allocate this funding. And so we are encouraging, and we have materials on our website at the Maine Association of Nonprofits that is a report put out by our national counterpart around language that you can use in talking with your public officials in inquiring how they're planning on making their allocations. Because if your organization is serving and meeting direct important community needs, you want to make sure that your public officials know about that and that they understand that ARPA funding can technically be used for nonprofits if they choose to allocate it in that way. So talking with public officials about ARPA funding. The other thing I want to remind everyone, if you don't already know, is that some of the state of Maine's ARPA funding, which Governor Mills and her administration came out with the Jobs and Recovery Act, which was voted on and came into law in July of 2021. And she has a whole, on the state website, there's a whole page about how that money is being divvied up. And one of the things that nonprofits are eligible for, small nonprofits, there are criteria. So everything I say it's particular to you may be eligible, but there is a fund that the first round, the deadline was late November. And I was just confirmed that this morning with the state DECD that they will be reopening that program in somewhere around April, because they still, it's on the website around the Small Business and Nonprofit Recovery Grant Program. There are definitely criteria in terms of you have to be able to show demonstrable loss of 20% in revenue, that sort of thing. But you might be eligible for that, and there is going to be a second round. So those are two examples of very specific things. And then whenever, if you want to, Carol, I can get into some of the policy options that we are lobbying for in DC with regards to some other things like tax credits.
So let me just make sure I understand, Jennifer. So if the federal money isn't actually going to be distributed, or the decisions won't be made until 2023 and then be distributed the following year, there's potential for finding some gap money, some safety net money by going to the state DECD resources now. Is that, or when they reopen that program in April? Is that
potentially? I don't want to confuse what the state's doing with the deadlines. And again, these are just what the federal government has said the outside date is. Some municipalities or counties have made their decisions. The allocation decision making is done, and it's, you know, the door has been closed in some cases. But there is an opportunity to find out if your local town and or county have made those decisions or not. If they haven't, we're just letting people know that you have, that the federal government has said they don't have to determine until 2024. But that doesn't mean that anybody is necessarily holding on to that money. Okay. In terms of the state does have a plan for the money, just some of it hasn't actually gone out the door yet. And the state's money, they have said that they're holding a certain number of millions for the small business and nonprofit recovery grants. And their first round was, the deadline was November. This second round is still slated to happen sometime in April.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it. So before we get to the policy changes, let me just ask our other two panelists, Barbara or Jeannette, how are your organizations preparing for the upcoming federal assistance? Are there particular things that either your organization is in line hopefully to receive, or are you offering advice to your membership about ways that they can present themselves to take advantage of those resources? I'll ask Jeannette first because she's unmuted. Barbara, you're still muted.
I have something to say. Yes, so the one thing I would add is we clearly are relying on and encourage Jen's leadership in this realm amongst the nonprofit community and fully support that. And so in an effort to not be duplicative, the conversations that I'm hearing as part of the funding community is interest in finding ways to build capacity for organizations to be competitive for these grants. And so if that is as part of a collaborative, and usually it's larger organizations who are best positioned to be able to manage federal dollars, so whether it's supporting collaborative or other internal capacity with organizations, we want to see the nonprofit community competitive for this. And I think, philanthropy in particular is best positioned to kind of provide an influx of capacity building support to be able to make sure that that happens within Maine-based organizations.
Okay, great. And Barbara, can you add to that?
First off, I'll underscore and echo everything that Jeannette said relative to where I see philanthropy being able to fit into this ecosystem. I think the other thing that I want to add to what Jeannette said is because we're right now talking about a lot of state and or federal dollars, those dollars come with particular requirements for the application process, for the eligibility, for reporting both what occurs and from a financial standpoint. And for some organizations that may be newer organizations or smaller organizations, that can be a big stretch to be eligible and or to maintain the systems to be able to apply. And so part of the technical assistance that we've been thinking about with some other philanthropies is how can we build the capacity to manage those funds and support organizations that may be running on really thin margins, perhaps with funding that just gives them a little more room to be able to actually manage the funds that are coming from the Fed. So thinking about using some philanthropic dollars to leverage the federal dollars.
Okay, that's great. And is MHAF in particular positioning itself to do that? Are you saying that that's internally, that's something that your organization has been pursuing?
We're working with a number of other funding organizations to try to put together a sort of coherent approach to supporting some of the smaller organizations, some immigrant-led organizations in the state, so that they can be ready and support one another in applying for and receiving these dollars. The other thing that we did, frankly, all through the pandemic is we tried to stay in close contact with our colleagues at state government to find out when funds were being released and what they would be focused on, and how the dollars would flow to organizations. Would it be a grant? Would it be a contract? Would it be a cost reimbursed contract? Or would they get money up front? And we actually provided a variety of types of funding that filled in some of the gaps. So if some organizations that were doing community-based work were going to be reimbursed based on their costs, so they had to put the money out up front, hire the people up front, and then they would be reimbursed. Imagine a small community-based organization facing that kind of a financial challenge. And so we tried to get some dollars out there to smooth that until the point at which they would be able to actually get the cost reimbursement.
Okay, so almost bridge financing, sort of.
Yeah, kind of in the form of a grant. Yes.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And so Jennifer, now, if you want to talk about the policy initiatives that could have some repercussions in terms of assistance for Maine nonprofits, that'd be great.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Carol. So first, let me say that the Maine Association of Nonprofits, with our partners at the National Council of Nonprofits, are acutely aware of the continued pressures on particularly smaller nonprofits, but across the board with workforce shortages and increasing demands. And so we are hard at work at trying to figure out solutions for that are going to support the nonprofit community. And right now we are focusing on our federal and our state partners in that. And so there are a number of things that we are doing to advocate on the behalf of nonprofits, charitable nonprofits, to receive continued relief. And one of them is the extension of the employee retention tax credit. This is something that came out early on during the pandemic that enabled small businesses and nonprofits to get a refund on payroll taxes if they happen to have employees, and they could file to get payroll taxes credited back to them. Early on in the pandemic, you didn't see nonprofits using it a lot because you weren't able to couple that with the PPP loan. But now that the PPP program is no longer an option, there's increasing interest in the employee retention tax credit. Right now in DC, there's quite a bit of activity. More and more of our Congress people are signing on to a bill that would, originally this tax credit was available till the end of 2021. When things started softening up in the pandemic in late summer, early fall, that was repealed and it was pulled back to a third quarter deadline. We are trying to get it to be put back into place to be for the fourth quarter of 2021. And that's the bill that's currently under consideration in Congress. And we are working really hard with our national partners to do that. So if that's something that anyone on this call is interested in, your advocacy with the state, with our congressional delegation, would be helpful in letting them know that that bill is of interest to you and would be supportive to you. And then we also have a longer term effort to have that tax credit, as well as other policy options and relief options in DC, extend into 2022. So suffice to say that now is the time to advocate on the behalf of the extension of what's called the ERTC. MAMP can get more information out to everybody. We have actually just sent out an e-blast in our, and we have put the information in our weekly newsletter. So now's the time to be advocating for that and stay in touch with what we're doing with our national partners on extending relief into 2022.
And so also, Jennifer, thank you for, that's a great summary of what's going on around that tax credit. For folks who are wondering, our whole entire conversation is recorded. And that includes our chat, and in the chat are all the links for the resources that some of our panelists are mentioning or that I'm mentioning. So if this information is available to you after the fact, and so you don't have to scribble down the links if you're watching this in real time. We'll make that easy for you. If you registered for this event, you will get the recording and all of the links delivered to your inbox. So, and I mentioned one of those links, the HR Power Hour, which is a locally produced radio show that looks at HR issues, had a really good presenter on in late January who was talking in a very nuts and bolts and accessible way about the employee retention tax credit and how it may be helpful for small businesses and nonprofits. So it's like a half an hour, you can check that out as well. Before we go to the next question, I just wanted to ask Barbara or Jeannette, are there policy initiatives that are on your radar screen that are maybe happening in Washington that people ought to be aware of? This is sort of your opportunity to lobby if you see something particularly significant.
I think Barbara is prohibited from lobbying. So. No, not at this point. So we have an advocacy committee that's currently working on a legislative agenda, and part of that is aligning ours with Maine Association of Nonprofits. And so I'll probably sound like a broken record, but I defer to Jen in many realms when it comes to the effectiveness of nonprofits and policy issues as it relates to them.
Okay. Well, good. Well, then let's go.
Carol, and I was just going to say, to clarify, as a private foundation, we can't lobby except on issues that directly relate to our own existence or tax status, what have you. There are other foundations that are public charities that have a little bit more flexibility. So just for the world out there, foundations come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes, and be sure to check in with the foundations you work for about what they can and can't do.
Good. Thank you for that, Barbara. So my next question has to do with sort of trends. In preparing for this conversation, I saw a lot of research that points to national data where nonprofits are relying more on philanthropy and big donors, sort of the outsized impact of Mackenzie Scott. And then on the other end of the giving spectrum, there's been more involvement from grassroots contributions and less sort of in that middle part of the spectrum on traditional grant making and fundraising activities. And I'm curious, are you seeing that here? And if so, what are the effects that you're seeing in the Maine landscape? Jeannette, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. I keep on trying to press my space bar to unmute, but it is not working. So pardon my scrambling. So I was trying to think about this and whether or not I had some good insight on what it looks like on the ground in Maine. Fair warning that this is all anecdotal, since our giving data lags about a couple of years because of federal filing deadlines. And so I think from what we've seen philanthropy here in Maine be really consistent in giving. Early on in the pandemic, folks didn't know what was going to be happening with their endowments, but I think, now we are very well aware of how well the stock market has performed. And so what that has meant is the increase in folks' endowments means that they actually have to give out more money. So each foundation has to give out at least 5% of their, and it's more tricky than that, but of 5% of their endowment annually. And as that grows, the 5% grows as well. So we've seen folks stepping up. We've also been part of conversations where people are going above and beyond the 5%, recognizing that this is an incredible time, a once in a lifetime event or multiple lifetime event with the pandemic and with the outcry for racial justice, both here locally and nationally. Folks have really stepped up to support those movements here. And so we've seen philanthropy here in Maine be really responsive to the time. I would say, in my experience, it makes sense in part because those gifts are built on relationships. Gifts with big donors and gifts with philanthropy over this time are built on existing or budding relationships. Whereas, traditional fundraising activities, in part also because people can't go places to have those fundraising activities, right? It's really hard to connect folks in this way. And so you really do get more bang for your buck, or ROI, when you leverage your relationship with philanthropy and larger donors. And people were feeling particularly generous at the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm not comfortable saying whether or not that continues to this day, in particular since some of the uncertainty around inflation and the economy. And so, I would say there's also some virtual event burnout. Certainly I see individual meeting burnout on Zoom, and we've probably all done a bunch of Zoom, back-to-back, Zoom to Zoom. So as traditional fundraising activities continue to not be a safe way for folks to engage in that activity, we see people not doing that. But and I would say one of the harder hit sectors here in Maine, or at least anecdotally, more difficult to access during this pandemic was actually corporate giving. So not across the board. We've certainly seen a lot of banks step up, Multiyear Savings Bank being one of them. But in other realms, the uncertainty around the economy and corporate partners here in Maine had initially, I think, had folks kind of reassessing their ability to commit to some community impact investments. Mm-hmm. And I think the last thing is that, you know, as you look as a nonprofit, as you look at nonprofits as somebody who's fundraised, who continues to fundraise, right? Although in a different way, that individual donors are your most sustainable donors. And so I'm always a strong proponent of cultivating a consistent individual donor and grassroots giving program, because in the long term, you know, philanthropy is good for certain things. You can leverage it for growth, for investment, for opportunities, but philanthropy has most of the time a horizon. And so it'll be the individual donors who will continue to stay with you through uncertain times. And when there are exceptionally uncertain times, hopefully philanthropy steps up and is able to fill some of those gaps.
Thank you. How about you, Barbara? What are you seeing?
You know, I see it from a combination of perspectives. One is what we're hearing, what we're being asked to do, and how we're responding as a foundation. And then I also see it in the nonprofit organizations that I'm affiliated with, and how they're trying to pivot and change the way that they're doing their business. From a foundation standpoint, we really set aside for big chunks of our giving in the past couple of years, lots of grant requirements. And in fact, at the beginning of the pandemic, during 2020, we did 3 rounds of what we call directed grants that represented close to half of our grant making. And essentially, we were identifying sectors that were important relative to our own strategic focus. So different kinds of organizations, different population groups that we care about and feel like we need to support. And we were frankly contacting them and saying, we're trying to provide grants to tribal governments to ensure that you are ready and able to respond to the pandemic in your communities. And essentially it was a phone conversation, and we put the information into our own grants management system, and then we sent a check. And so that was far less about people approaching us for funding. I think perhaps the bottom line takeaway for folks on the call who work in nonprofits is trying to build relationships with funders that are really as honest as you feel you can be, so that they know both your sort of the things that you feel like you do well, but also the places where you're struggling, where you have problems. But the transparency of relationship can often give us as funders an insight that says, oh my gosh, we've got to make sure that this group of organizations is still here on the other side of the pandemic. For some of the other nonprofits I'm affiliated with in other parts of my life, it's been fascinating to see, use of technology for fundraising, more online kinds of auctions, more creativity about how do you try to build experiences that are more remote versus group experiences. So I think there's a number of innovations that have happened, but I would also echo Jeanette's comment about the fatigue that is coming from being in this kind of setting versus an in-person setting after all of this time.
Yes, agreed. And Jen, what about you? What are you seeing from your perspective in terms of trends around the landscape of giving? Are you seeing there being more of a trend of big donors and philanthropy giving? Sort of what Jeannette and Barbara were referring to as the donors stepping up and increasing the contributions. I think the state set a record for charitable giving in 2020 and was on pace to do so again in 2021, a reflection of increased giving because people recognize that these are extraordinary times. But is it a combination of the big donor and the grassroots effort, or what are you seeing in terms of where that energy is coming from?
Yeah, so all of that, right? So the thing to remind ourselves about what we've been experiencing is that it's extraordinary. And so even the surveys that are coming out about giving, or the traditional ways that we evaluate, compare this year to last year, like all of that needs to be considered with a very careful eye. I just want to, first of all, encourage people to look beyond the headlines when they hear about a giving report that's coming out, or any kind of generalization that's made about giving. There is no doubt that our colleagues in philanthropy, many of them did what Jeannette and Barbara suggested, which is they became very much more proactive and flexible. Many of them gave more than they ever have done, and again, stepped up. And all of this is great and appropriate. And we know it didn't work for everybody. It worked for many nonprofits that have existing relationships with donors who have resources were able to figure out how to make it through 2020 okay. And then it turns out pretty well through 2021. Combination of federal or state relief, combination of dedicated networks and access to donors, okay. But if we just say to ourselves as a sector, well, mostly we all did okay, that is just not a headline that tells an adequate story as to what's really going on. And an example of that is exactly what you're saying. And when I say big donor, I'm talking about mega donor. I'm talking about the Bill Gates and the Mackenzie Scotts of the world. And one of the surveys that we saw last year, if you took out the Mackenzie Scott money, donation levels actually went down.
Right.
Okay. So this accumulation of wealthier people giving more money. Okay. And what does that mean? That means that that person or a small set of individuals is deciding where that money goes. When that happens, there are going to be losers. And that's where I want to focus, is who's not already getting access to those big donors, who don't already know the right people to talk to, who to rub elbows with. In this case, we're still really relying on those networked relationships rather than looking at what are actually the needs in the communities and how are we all coming around the table to solve them. So yes, there are studies out there that are saying that donors are stepping up and they're doing, they're opening up their wallets. Yep, you can find evidence of that. There's also good evidence that some organizations are having a lot of luck with social media, and that the whole idea of younger generations or people who engage in social media, they'll press that button for that extra $50, and they're seeing some success there. Those are all really important things to look at. But I just want to caution us to make big global observations like, oh, charitable giving, it's going up 10%. That's great, but to who?
Right.
And who's getting it and for what reason? And what is it doing to the democratization of sharing our resources so we do what we want to get done in communities?
And I think I would add that, as much data out there anymore because of what happened with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act about individual giving. And so the threshold for itemization of deductions had increased. So we can't even really understand, except for larger givers, how money is moving from individuals throughout the state. And so, you know, if you look at our most recent giving report, we actually didn't do an individual one this year because the data just isn't consistently there anymore. And so it's been harder to navigate just what the picture looks like realistically. We focus on talking about philanthropy and how we can make philanthropy more accountable and shine some light there. The other pieces, and I think Randy mentioned this in the chat as a piece of policy, is the Accelerating Charitable, and I always forget the E, but it's an act that's sponsored by Senator King and Representative Pingree in the House. It is intended to make foundations spend more money in some ways, and it really targets what we call as donor advised funds, or DAFs, and those are increasingly popular ways to give money into communities, and they are hard to navigate. We have good stewards of DAFs here in Maine and Maine Community Foundation who advocate for small and large Maine-based organizations and really educate their donors on what's happening and distribute the money that's within those donor advised funds. But we also have very large donor advised national organizations that work here in Maine, like Schwab and Fidelity. And those are really opaque. And so what they are tax-wise is the donor can set up a fund and they get the tax incentive in the year that they put the money in. There is little obligation to no obligation for those funds to be distributed in any sort of timeline into community to nonprofits. And so in theory, donors are getting the tax incentives for doing a good job and for distributing that money. But if you look at national data, the actual infusion of that cash into communities is really sad and disappointing as a statistic. And so that the ACE Act is meant to put some regulations behind that, to sunset some foundation or some donor advised funds that are inactive or have giving requirements annually, to provide accountability and transparency. So that the good stewards of donor advised funds like Maine Community Foundation can continue their great work, and that the other folks who are providing essentially a service for donor advised funds as a service are required to then invest that money into communities in a reasonable timeline. So there's opinions on both sides about whether or not those are good or bad. And you can read all of those if you just Google it. But that is another way in which policy-wise, people are trying to incentivize the giving, both here and nationally.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say it's accelerating charitable efforts. I always forget the E as well. And one national organization that has a really robust set of information about the ACE Act and related kinds of things is Independent Sector. So I'd encourage those that want to learn more about that particular piece of legislation to look at Independent Sector.
Great. So we're getting close to the time when we'll start to take questions. So let me just ask one more quick one. And you have all sort of touched on this in some way or another, but with in-person gatherings closed down or severely constrained because of pandemic concerns, and those traditional income streams for nonprofits being sidelined or reduced, I'm just curious, are you seeing some innovation out there with respect to generating revenue? Something that's impressing you in terms of a creative approach to generate revenue that's outside of the traditional lines? Lots of studious faces. Okay, Jen.
I'm happy to jump in. And someone has just chatted. We'd love to hear examples from people who are attending today. If you have a particular idea, that would be fun to hear about. Carol, I think the most inspiring creative examples that I saw was just how quickly nonprofits figured out how to use the technology to pivot their traditional activities to online ones. And so in some ways, the reason why I hesitate is just because so many nonprofits so cleverly were able to figure out how to do online 5Ks, for example, or virtual sleep-ins, or, you know, figured out the Animal Refuge League always does an event where people can go and stay in spend the night in the shelter, but they pivoted that to be online. That it's almost no longer particularly creative because so many have had success that way. I think my major message here for nonprofits is I've been most impressed with the organizations that aren't letting the current circumstances get them down. They're charging ahead and they're figuring out ways to make it work, whether it means they're going to have the same event, but they're going to be intrepid Mainers and they're going to stand in the rain, or they're going to not be shy about letting everyone know about the critical services they're providing to their communities. So there's so many different examples out there that it's hard to narrow in on just one, but I think I'm most inspired for those people who just are determined not to give up, and they're just figuring out ways to get out there and do what they've been doing all along.
Good. Well, let's transition now to questions from the audience. And this one came in from one of our registrants, and that is, are you seeing mergers, collaborations, or pooling of resources among nonprofits as a way to survive the pandemic? And I'm going to give that to Barbara. I think you first, because I think you were talking about there being more of an effort of collaboration among the funders. So I'm curious, are you seeing collaboration or mergers among the recipients of the funds?
Not mergers as much as maybe one would imagine. Again, I interact with a smaller universe, and it's a universe that's really in the healthcare, health, community health realm. But I think there have been many more conversations around how to work together creatively, either in doing what it is that an organization does as far as service in the community, identifying whether there are ways for some kind of back office functions to be shared, or to have small nonprofits actually hire other small nonprofits or contract with them to do that work. And then, interestingly enough, we fund a number of advocacy organizations in the state so that they are able to do much more health advocacy. We provide some general operating support grants so that they have a little more funding breathing room. And part of what we also do is try to connect them now virtually. And over the past few years, what we've seen is that the networks among those advocacy organizations have increased, and there's increasing understanding of one another's advocacy issues and populations. And from interviews with those grantees, it sounds like there are, in fact, some more opportunities where either common issues, policy issues, or issues that relate to one another that can move policy discussions forward, because you're sort of bringing two different perspectives to that issue, have happened. So I am seeing some of that. And I'll turn it over to Jen. I suspect you have an entire raft full of examples, both of it potentially happening and of reasons why there are times when probably not to do that.
Yeah, well, all I'll say is that it's certainly would be a little premature to be seeing direct mergers out of the pandemic, just because those types of situations take a long time to develop. So I can't say that I've seen more mergers. But I have seen alliances and cooperation. So I completely agree with Barbara in terms of how nonprofits are, through necessity, seeing the benefits of collaborating. And I just want to take this opportunity to highlight that, give a little bit of advice, which is always dangerous. So apologize in advance. But when, if you do decide that you're going to go to a potential funder, or particularly a public official, to talk about your circumstances, I would highly encourage you to go as an alliance, or to go as an informal coalition, if you will, finding other organizations that have complementary missions to yours, and identifying what the service you have in the community that should not be lost. And then you go and you focus on that problem, and how collectively you each are playing a critical role in addressing that problem. And so I just want to underscore the benefit of working in concert with your nonprofit partners, way before any discussions around mergers or sharing a photocopier, more about this advocacy notion. And we have seen successful, we have seen alliances form around the ARPA funding in particular, that have been reported on, around people coming together and collectively asking. So the benefit of these cooperative efforts are definitely, we're seeing evidence of them forming, and I encourage all of you on the line to figure out if you can work on some ways of that benefiting your situation as well.
That's a great idea. I think that strategy of trying to form a coalition and collaboratively pursue those ends, as opposed to seeing other nonprofits as competitors for that same pile of money, is a really effective strategy. Strawberry, let's take a question from our 6 questions in the Q&A queue.
Sure. So we've got one question here. How do we advocate and work with our legislators and stay within the law that nonprofits cannot lobby?
Well, that's a really important question. And we have materials on our website that can help you with that. That's one of the things that Maine Association of Nonprofits offers, is giving you resources so that you know that you do stay within the law. I will say, just in general, we find that nonprofits are sometimes surprised that they can do, apart from the private foundations, very distinct from the private foundations, as Barbara alluded to earlier. People are often surprised at how much they can do. And so I would just encourage you to go to our Maine Association of Nonprofits website to get specific answers around that question. I wouldn't want to start characterizing it, because I'm bound to get some of the definitions wrong, and then that would be bad advice.
Yeah. And I'm not oh, go ahead, Barbara, did you want to go?
I was just going to hop in and say, for any philanthropic partners that are listening in today, by providing general operating support to organizations that are doing the advocacy on the issues that are relevant to your own mission, that makes things a whole lot easier for those nonprofit organizations to do the kinds of things that you will find on the Maine Association of Nonprofits website.
That's what I was going to say, Barbara. So
How about another question, Strawberry?
Regarding Maine giving, are you hearing or seeing that foundations are willing to gift more than 5%? Are you hearing or seeing that foundations are understanding the powerful impact that multi-year general operating has on our annual budgets, i.e. transformative unicorn funding?
We're going to ask Barbara to answer that one first, because I know that she had already been to her board and made an argument for lifting the 5% restriction because of the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic. So Barbara, what do you think?
Sure. I know of a number of foundations in Maine that went beyond their 5% requirement, went beyond their giving levels of prior years. You know, in some cases that might have been multi-year support, but I suspect in many cases it may have been 1 or 2 year support that's very much pandemic driven. Again, I think it depends a little bit on the what kind of foundation we're talking about. Some of the foundations in Maine are governed by a law, the Uniform Prudent Management of Investment Funds Act, fondly known as UPMIFA, which actually puts some limitations on how far above that 5% you can go and still be considered in compliance with the way you've been funded or the way you've been established. There are also a number of foundations, and MHAF is in that group, that are looking much more seriously at multi-year funding. We have one program that will be, in the end, providing 7 years of general operating support funding. Our advocacy program, we are going to be putting a proposal to our board, and my board chair is on this call, to have the next round of our advocacy funding be for a 4-year time span. So that has not been approved, but we're hopeful that it will be, and I suspect some of the advocacy grantees may be on this call as well. So please keep all of your fingers and toes crossed. But it is something that a number of the funders are starting to think about and talk about, realizing that it is a much more predictable and sustainable way for those who are funded to receive their dollars. Now, of course, when we do that, that means that we're funding that group of organizations. And so we also talk about how do we create more predictable funding opportunities from a timing standpoint. And we've really been trying to do that as well over the past couple of years, so that we're trying to build a couple of grant programs that happen at essentially the same time each year. They may not, they're more programmatic, they're not general operating support, but they will at least become something that organizations can look forward to, saying, oh, I know that the opportunity to apply for that is going to be coming in April. And I know the opportunity for that is going to be coming in October, what have you. And I think that is another way to build in some predictability. And that is not a case where we're locking in the organizations for a long period of time. These are 1 and 2 year grants.
And we're all going to keep our fingers crossed that the stock market continues to perform as strongly as it has, because that's what really affects what the value of an endowment fund is, and will have direct impact on what money is available for distribution. So fingers crossed on that score. Strawberry, let's take another question in the queue.
Sure. For the economic recovery grants in Maine, are the eligibility criteria available now, or will that be published in April when the website says the additional 15 million will be available?
Do you know the answer to that, Jen?
I don't. I think that it's suffice to say that their website is the most up-to-date information, but they also have on that same website an email address where you can ask questions, and I believe they have a regular email that goes out. And so if you aren't already connected, I would connect yourself directly to DECD, because my impression is they have not released those, and they certainly didn't share with me any deadline or any timeline for when that might be available.
Okay. Next question.
Even though the COVID pandemic is ending, why would philanthropies not give as much going forward, given that we have a climate crisis, opioid epidemic, and more? We might be able to solve the crises, not just kick it down the road.
So the question is, why aren't philanthropies giving more? Is that it, Strawberry?
I think so. That's what I'm getting from it.
Okay. How about you, Jeannette, since you're the Maine Philanthropy Center person?
Sure. Well, philanthropy, as you know, is centuries old institutions and practices, and it takes a lot to move that iceberg, right? And we're talking about a really small subset of philanthropies who have been stepping up. You know, I think Barbara and I run in the same circles, but there's over, I think, 300 or so registered philanthropies here in Maine, and we just touch upon a small number of them. And so I don't have a good answer for you, except for that, you know, it's MPC's goal to continue to drive those conversations around increasing giving and continuing giving at a level, in particular in Maine during these times of crises, and where there is opportunity to leverage good federal funding to really create transformative change here for Maine people.
And I would echo everything that Jeannette said, and also say that philanthropy is a part of the solution. But if you look at the kinds of problems and challenges that you're describing, the opiate epidemic, substance use disorder in general, climate change, et cetera, that takes government funding and significant government funding and policy. And certainly philanthropy has a role in inspiring that, in augmenting it, in leveraging it, in bridging it, and in helping to get policies changed. But yes, endowments are big and government funding is bigger. So we have to have it all happening to take on these really huge issues.
That's great. Thank you. I thought you summed that up nicely. And sadly, we have run out of time. So let me just take a moment to thank everyone, our sponsors. I was delighted to see so many members of our audience putting examples of how they've been creative about fundraising, or here are some resources that have really worked for them, sharing those links and those experiences. I think that this sector has really pulls for one another. And so, so I'm grateful that so many people participated in this conversation. I am really grateful to our panelists, who I think were wonderful, articulate, really experienced and insightful. I really appreciate that, that you all had time to share your insight with us today. Again, this entire webinar will be available on the Press Herald website, and if you registered for it, we will email it to you, and that will include all of the links, and hopefully that last question in the queue there, we'll get an answer to that and include that with the email that we distribute. And so again, thanks to everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.